Why was everyone suddenly silent? Moments ago, the ballroom had been alive with laughter, champagne flutes clinking, polished metals, catching the soft amber light that spilled across marble floors. The annual Armed Forces Gala was meant to celebrate service and sacrifice, but all that glitter had turned brittle the instant Colonel Alastair Finch's voice cut through the air like a bayonet. "Tell me," he said, his tone sharp, mocking, "who invited that?" Heads turned. The orchestra faltered. Even the waiters froze. The colonel's gaze had locked on a single figure standing near the back, a woman, still, composed, unflinching beneath the scrutiny of 100 eyes. Corporal Ara Vance didn't move. Her uniform wasn't the crisp navy or olive of the ceremonial kind. It was a faded utility, the kind that had seen dust, grit, and things the ballroom would never smell or feel. No medals adorned her chest, no stripes glimmered on her sleeves. Just a single, small shoulder patch, a hawk gripping a bolt of lightning, something almost no one recognized. The colonel chuckled, low and derisive. Did someone mistake this for a field exercise? The laughter that followed was nervous, awkward, the sort of laughter that feeds off power. Admirals exchanged uncertain glances. Young lieutenants hid their smirks behind glasses of wine. Somewhere, a photographer lowered his camera. And yet Ara didn't blink. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, her back perfectly straight, chin lifted not in arrogance but in quiet defiance. Her uniform might have been worn, but it was spotless, pressed with care, a soldier's discipline etched in every seam. Her expression was unreadable, a calm mask that somehow made the colonel's booming laughter feel small. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" No one answered. The colonel took a step forward, his medals glinting. "Soldier, are you lost? Or did you wander in here thinking it was the mess hall?" That line earned him a few approving chuckles from the crowd. But not from everyone. Near the back, a gray-haired general adjusted his glasses, watching her closely. There was something in her stillness, something familiar. The way her shoulders squared under pressure. The subtle, unconscious way her eyes scanned exits, surfaces, lines of sight. She wasn't just standing there. She was aware, calculating, contained, like someone who'd been taught long ago that survival begins with silence. But to most in the room, she was invisible. Just another forgotten soldier. Probably some underdecorated junior officer clinging to a sense of belonging in a place meant for the elite. Ara let the colonel's words hang in the air. Then nothing, no reply. Her silence rippled across the ballroom, unsettling. Silence has weight, and hers carried more than anyone there understood. Colonel Finch frowned. "I asked you a question, Corporal." He emphasized the rank with disdain, though she had never given it. "Or do you think you're above answering a superior?" Ara inhaled slowly, eyes steady. Her heart was calm, but beneath the surface old reflexes stirred. Years of command briefings, interrogation rooms, field calls over encrypted comms. She had been trained to hold her tongue until words mattered. She knew that speaking too soon could reveal too much. And tonight of all nights, silence was her armor. Still, the sting of humiliation pricked her chest. She'd only come here for a friend, an old squad mate receiving a medal she herself had quietly helped earn. She hadn't wanted the spotlight. She never did. But the invitation had arrived anyway, handwritten, folded neatly with a note. "Come. It's time you stood among them again." She almost hadn't come. Maybe she shouldn't have. Now, under the colonel's glare, she felt the old ache of isolation return, the familiar weight of being out of place, even among those who should have been family. A young officer at a nearby table whispered something to his date. They laughed. Ara caught it, the kind of laugh that thinks it knows what courage looks like because it's seen the posters, not the battlefield. The colonel's tone hardened. "If you have nothing to say, perhaps you should be escorted out." Someone near the bar murmured, probably some clerk who never left the wire. Another, "Look at that patch, not even regulation." the hawk and lightning bolt, the insignia no one recognized, the emblem she had earned in the dust and ruin of places whose names were never spoken on record. Her throat tightened not from fear, but from the ache of memory, the smell of diesel and ash, the screams over broken comms, the night the sky turned white with tracer fire over Helmand Province. A flash, just one image buried deep, of a call sign whispered in static, resolute. She blinked it away. "Colonel," came a quiet voice from across the room, a general trying perhaps to diffuse. "She may be a guest, let's not." But Finch raised a hand. "No, no, this is a uniformed event. Respect must be maintained." Respect. The word hit Ara like a weight. She'd watched friends die nameless in fields where no medals would reach. She'd carried men heavier than herself through mud and fire for commanders who never remembered their names. And now this man, this polished emblem of self-importance, dared to lecture her about respect. She almost smiled, not a smile of mockery, but of something sadder, the kind that knows the truth and pities those who don't. Still, she said nothing. The ballroom's hum turned restless. People shifted in their chairs. A few tried to look away, ashamed of their own silence. Others watched with cruel fascination, waiting for her to break. Then a voice cut through. "What's that on her shoulder?" A warrant officer, rigid as iron, pointed. "That patch doesn't look like any division I've seen. Some kind of knockoff." That earned laughter again, short, brittle. Ara's eyes flicked toward him. Just once. The kind of look that stops laughter cold, though she didn't mean to. It was instinct, the stare of someone who's seen what happens when mockery gives way to chaos. A hush followed. From somewhere near the back, the soft chime of a glass echoed, and with it, the faint sound of a man shifting in his seat, unnoticed by most, but not by Ara. Years of combat had sharpened her senses beyond normal awareness. Even here, surrounded by chandeliers and polished brass, her body moved like it remembered danger. Every sound was a signal, every silence a warning. The colonel, sensing his grip on the crowd faltering, straightened. "Well, soldier," he said, stepping closer, "perhaps you'd like to explain which service allows such unconventional attire." His smile was all teeth. Ara lifted her eyes, calm, unbroken. "This uniform," she said softly, "is the only one that was ever truly mine." It wasn't a challenge, it was truth. But the colonel misheard it, thought it insolence. He took another step, the crowd's tension swelling like a storm about to break. "Your service," he repeated, mocking. "I've served 30 years and never seen anything quite so unremarkable." And that's when it happened, a subtle shift, invisible unless you were paying attention. At the far edge of the room, a man in a dark navy uniform paused mid-conversation. His eyes, calm but sharp, locked onto the small patch on Ara's shoulder. For a heartbeat, his expression changed, disbelief, recognition, then something deeper. Respect. He didn't move, not yet. Ara, unaware of his gaze, slowly unclipped something from her lapel. A small coin, dull, tarnished, almost hidden in her palm. Her fingers turned it over with a deliberate motion, and the faint light revealed an engraving. One word. Resolute. And below it numbers, coordinates. No one noticed yet except the man in the navy uniform. His jaw tightened. The name hit him like a ghost. Ara stared down at the coin for a moment, her thumb brushing its worn edge, the edge that had cut her once when she held it too tightly. The night she'd been told they wouldn't all make it out alive. A whisper echoed in her mind, her old team leader's voice. "If you ever come home, don't explain, just carry it." So she had for years. Now the colonel's words were a distant hum. The laughter gone. Even the music had faded into a cold, waiting silence. Ara lifted her gaze again, not defiant, just steady. In that moment she wasn't in a ballroom. She was back in the dust, headset crackling, heart pounding, holding a radio that refused to die. The same silence, the same weight. Someone murmured, "What's she doing?" But before anyone could speak again, a voice broke the stillness. Calm, firm, resonant. "Colonel." Every head turned. The Navy officer, tall, broad-shouldered, medals neat on his chest, stepped forward. His tone was clipped precise. "You owe that soldier an apology." A hush absolute. The colonel blinked. "Excuse me." The man came closer, stopping just a few feet from Ara. His eyes never left hers. "You heard me," he said quietly. Then he did something that froze the entire room. He raised his hand and saluted. Slowly, deliberately, with the precision of someone who understood exactly who stood before him. The colonel's voice faltered. The murmurs stopped. Every sound vanished into a silence that seemed to hum with meaning. The woman they had mocked was being saluted by a Navy SEAL lieutenant commander. No one knew why. Not yet. But in that moment, every heartbeat in the room held the same question: who was Ara Vance? And what had she done to earn that salute? Nobody moved. The entire ballroom, hundreds of polished shoes and glittering ranks, seemed carved out of stone. The only sound was the soft hum of the chandeliers and the faint, uneven breath of those who had just witnessed something they didn't yet understand. A Navy SEAL lieutenant commander had just saluted a woman everyone else had mocked. Colonel Finch's throat worked soundlessly as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. His eyes darted from the SEAL's steady arm to Ara's calm, still figure. The salute lingered, heavy as judgment. And then slowly, deliberately, Lieutenant Commander Nathan Miller lowered his hand. He took one step forward, another, each movement precise, carrying the quiet force of authority earned the hard way, in places far removed from the perfume-soaked air of this ballroom. When he stopped, he stood close enough that Ara could see the faint scar running along his jaw. It wasn't a ballroom scar. It was the kind you got from shrapnel, or worse. The kind that told you someone had been where it hurts to remember. "Colonel Finch," he said, his voice calm but sharp as glass, "perhaps you should know who you're addressing before you pass judgment." The colonel's face flushed red, part anger, part confusion. "And who exactly am I addressing, Lieutenant Commander? Because all I see is a corporal out of uniform and out of line." Nathan's jaw flexed. He turned to the crowd not to confront them but to correct them. "That insignia on her shoulder," he pointed, "belongs to Joint Special Operations Task Force 17, codename Resolute." A ripple went through the room. Not loud, just the sound of breath catching, of realization beginning to dawn. Several officers froze mid-gesture. One admiral's wineglass trembled in his hand. Ara didn't move. She didn't need to. The storm had already started to turn. "Resolute," Nathan repeated, his voice softer now, carrying an undercurrent of something personal. "You've heard the name whispered, haven't you? Some of you have read reports with half-redacted lines and unexplained citations for valor." He turned to Finch. "That coin she carries, those coordinates, 34 degrees north, 67 east, that's Objective Griffin." And with that, the silence became absolute again. Objective Griffin. To civilians, it meant nothing. But to those who'd served in the right shadows, it was a ghost story, a mission that wasn't supposed to have happened, a rescue buried under layers of classification. A suicidal operation that ended in every captive brought home and every aggressor neutralized. Finch's lips parted, the confidence draining from him. That was a classified engagement," he stammered. "Yes," Nathan said evenly. "Classified for everyone except those who were there." He looked at Ara again and something shifted in his tone. The edge softened. The respect deepened. "She was there." The words were simple, but they landed like artillery. Ara Vance, quiet, unassuming, standing in a faded uniform, had been part of that operation. The one whispered about in training halls, the one no one could ever prove. Finch's mouth opened again, but no sound came. He looked suddenly older, his medals feeling heavier. Nathan continued, turning slightly so his words reached the back of the room. Task Force Resolute was real, and the uniform you see, that's not regulation because it never had to be. They operated where rules didn't survive long enough to matter. And Corporal Vance, he paused, his voice almost breaking with reverence, wasn't just there. She was the reason it succeeded. Every eye swung back to Ara. She didn't flinch under the weight of recognition, didn't nod or smile or confirm. Her stillness spoke more than any words could. Nathan took a slow breath. Her transmissions under fire gave us the coordinates to move in. We were losing signal. Our birds couldn't lock on. She stayed behind enemy lines, jammed their frequencies manually, and when her team's position was compromised, she kept the channel open long enough for us to get them out. He looked down for a moment, memory flickering behind his eyes. I was the pilot on that extraction. If she hadn't broken protocol and sent that final burst, my crew wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't be standing here. The colonel's jaw clenched. Shame started to creep into his eyes, that rare moment when pride gives way to realization. For the first time since the confrontation began, Ara spoke again. Her voice was calm, low, but steady as steel. "Sir, I didn't come here for recognition." Nathan turned toward her, and there was something almost pained in his expression. "You didn't need to. You already earned it." The crowd shifted. No laughter now, no whispers. The atmosphere was dense with a kind of reverence no ceremony could orchestrate. At the far table, an older general exhaled, almost a sigh. "Good Lord." Ara's gaze drifted across the room, past the faces that had mocked her, the ones who'd looked through her like she didn't belong. And for a fleeting second, she felt the weight of every moment she'd spent invisible, every mission unspoken, every sacrifice that never made it to a citation or a news headline. This awkward, unfolding moment wasn't vindication, it was something quieter, sadder. Because the truth was, she didn't miss the battlefield, she missed purpose. Even standing here, in the glow of chandeliers and respect belatedly given, she felt the hollow echo of what she'd lost when she'd left the service. The rhythm of urgency, the pulse of belonging to something greater than herself. Finch broke the silence. "Corporal Vance," he managed, his voice cracking around the edges, "why didn't you say anything?" Ara's eyes softened. "Because, sir," she said quietly, "some stories don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who didn't come back." Her words landed softly, but they carried through the ballroom like a song sung to ghosts. Nathan's gaze fell just for a moment. He understood. He always had. Finch swallowed hard, his shoulders squaring out of habit more than conviction. I didn't know," he whispered. Ara gave him a faint, weary smile. "You weren't supposed to." And with that, something in the colonel broke. He looked around at the men and women still frozen at their tables, saw his reflection in their silence, and realized what his mockery had cost, not her, but himself. There are moments in a soldier's life when humility hits harder than any bullet. This was one of them. Nathan took a small step back, allowing her space. The crowd seemed to part for her without knowing why. She hadn't moved yet, hadn't taken a bow, hadn't accepted anything, but she already owned the room. One of the civilians near the front, a journalist, judging by his lanyard, whispered, "Why hasn't anyone written about her?" Another officer, his face pale, answered softly, "Because people like her don't ask to be remembered. They just make sure others are." Ara heard them, but she didn't react. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the faces of her team, on the sound of the helicopter blades that had meant salvation once upon a time, on the night she'd pressed her back to a concrete wall and whispered coordinates through static. She remembered the smell of blood and burned rubber, the cold, the way her hands had shaken when the radio finally went dead. That had been her last mission. When the team came home, she hadn't joined the others at the debrief. She walked straight past the hangars and never looked back. Her papers had been processed quietly. No medal ceremony, no speech, no music. Just a line on a record, honorably discharged, medical recovery recommended. Now here she stood, years later, being saluted by a SEAL in a ballroom full of strangers. She didn't want applause, she wanted peace. Nathan's voice came again, softer now, almost to her alone. "We thought you were gone. After Griffin, we never heard." Ara's eyes met his. There was no anger there, only exhaustion. "Some of us did go," she said, "just not in the way you think." The line hit him harder than any explosion ever had. He nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken. You can survive war and still never come back. The colonel stepped forward again, this time slower, humbled. His posture had changed, not rigid now but careful, almost reverent. He stopped in front of her and took a breath. "Corporal," he said quietly, "I was wrong." Ara shook her head slightly. "No, sir, you just didn't know what you were looking at." It wasn't bitterness, it was mercy. For the first time in the entire night, the colonel's face softened. "Then allow me to correct that." He straightened again, this time with purpose. Not authority, but respect. And then, before anyone could process it, Colonel Finch, decorated, proud, and until now unyielding, raised his hand and returned the salute that Nathan had begun. The room followed. A brigadier general stood, then an admiral, then another officer, then another, until every uniformed man and woman in the ballroom was standing, arms raised, faces solemn. The sound of fabric shifting filled the air, a soft, rustling wave that sounded almost like wind moving through a battlefield tent. Ara's chest tightened. Her eyes glistened, though she refused to let a tear fall. She had faced fire, but this silent, unanimous respect, cut deeper than anything she'd ever endured. For a long, fragile minute, no one spoke. Then Nathan lowered his hand first, and his voice broke the silence one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone steady but thick with emotion, "Corporal Ara Vance, hero of Task Force Resolute." Applause erupted, not polite, not staged, real, raw, a wave that seemed to shake the very chandeliers above them. Ara stood in its center, unflinching, her heart pounding in quiet disbelief. She didn't smile, she didn't bow. She simply nodded once and whispered words only she could hear. "For them." How does a moment begin? The one that divides before from after. For Ara Vance, it began with a whisper over a crackling headset. "Signal Delta confirmed. Extraction window, 90 minutes." The words cut through the darkness like a flare. Around her, the ruins of the Helmand outpost were nothing but twisted metal and dust. The air stank of cordite and burning diesel. Far off, a dog barked once, then silence again. She crouched behind a wall that used to be a school, fingers pressed to the radio handset. Her gloves were shredded, dried blood crusted at the fingertips. Across the room, Sergeant Merrick glanced at her, eyes wide beneath his helmet. "Comm still fried," he mouthed. She shook her head, "Not yet." He gave a grim nod, pulled the pin on a flash charge, and turned back toward the shattered courtyard. They had 7 hostages somewhere beyond that rubble and a line of enemy positions closing in. But the jammer, that cursed piece of Soviet metal, was still humming somewhere on the other side of the compound. If she couldn't kill the interference, the extraction birds would never find them. "Vance status," came a low voice in her ear. It was their captain, Ross Faber, somewhere 2 buildings north. "Working on it," she breathed. "Signal spike at grid 7-1. I'll need 3 minutes." "You've got one." Static, then gunfire. The room shuddered as Merrick fired into the dark. Spent shells clinked across the tiles. Ara closed her eyes for half a second, just enough to gather the trembling rhythm of her heart, and crawled to the open window. Outside, night pressed against the world like a living thing. Dust storm winds rolled low, muffling sound. Her training whispered the steps automatically. Breathe, move, sight, confirm. But underneath it all, something older beat through her veins, a memory of every name etched on the inside of her mind, the ones who'd never gotten this far. She slipped into the open, sprinted low across the alley. Sand cut at her throat. Behind her, Merrick covered, shouting something she couldn't hear. A flash lit the sky, then another. She reached the far wall, heart hammering. The jammer's pulse throbbed through the concrete, steady, mocking. 30 seconds, she thought. Command, I've got eyes on target. Do it fast, Corporal. Hostiles regrouping. She knelt beside the rusted case, tools shaking in her hands. The code panel was in Cyrillic, half smashed, half wired to a battery that shouldn't have worked. Whoever had built this had known exactly what they were doing. One wrong connection, and the whole thing would go up. Come on, she whispered, come on. The first wire came loose. The hum dropped an octave. Another twist, then a surge of feedback screeched through her earpiece. Vance were blind again. 10 seconds, she gasped. A burst of gunfire cracked the air. Bullets tore chunks from the wall above her head. She flinched, ducked, soldering iron shaking. The hum faltered once more and died. Silence, then faintly the clean tone of open comms. Eagle 1 to ground, we have your beacon. Repeat, we have it. She exhaled, dropped the tool, and leaned her forehead against the cold metal. Then came the scream. Medic, we're hit. Merrick's voice. She turned, running before she thought. The corridor blurred. Light, smoke, dust. She found him slumped by the door, vest torn, blood spreading fast across his side. Stay with me, she said, pressing her hands down. He looked at her and smiled through the pain. You got the signal. She nodded. Then it's worth it. Her throat clenched. Don't you dare. But he was already gone. The extraction team came 6 minutes later, 6 minutes too long. Rotor wash churned the dust into ghostly clouds. Lieutenant Miller himself stepped off the ramp, his visor streaked with dirt. Who's in charge? He shouted. Ara stood, blood and dust painting her face. No one left, sir. He looked at her, then down at the jammer still smoking behind her. Realization dawned. You did that. She nodded once. He didn't ask how, he just motioned to the crew, get her on board. As they lifted away, the horizon burned orange. Below them, the compound collapsed in on itself, taking secrets with it. In her lap, Merrick's dog tags were warm from her palm. She never remembered crying, but when the wind hit her face, it tasted of salt. Resolution achieved, mission complete. The radio confirmed it in a voice too calm to believe. But there's no word for what happens after complete. The memory broke like a wave, dragging her back to the present, to the ballroom, to the applause still echoing somewhere far away. She blinked, realizing she'd been staring at nothing. The chandeliers above her blurred, reflecting the same fiery glow of that night in Helmand. Nathan noticed first, Ara. She took a slow breath. I was just remembering. He didn't press, he didn't need to. The colonel was still standing near the podium, face pale, his hand trembling around an untouched glass of champagne. The earlier arrogance had evaporated. What remained was something raw, regret. I read the after-action report, he said quietly, almost to himself. They said the comms link came from a ghost signal, a miracle. Ara looked at him. There were no miracles out there, sir, just choices. The words hung between them like smoke. Behind her, a cluster of young officers, those same ones who had snickered before, watched with wide eyes, their expressions changed. Respect mixed with shame. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that heroism doesn't always come with a fanfare. Nathan turned toward the gathered crowd. Most of you have worn the uniform long enough to know what silence costs. Corporal Vance carried hers alone for years. Tonight, that ends. Ara shifted slightly, uncomfortable under the light. Please, sir, don't. But he raised a hand, gentle, not to glorify, to remember. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a matching coin, the same tarnished metal, the same coordinates. He placed it on the table before her. You weren't the only one who kept it. She looked at it for a long moment, then met his eyes. There was a quiet understanding there that words could never reach. I thought you were all gone, she murmured. Some of us are, he said softly, but we carry the same silence. Her throat tightened. The noise of the room seemed distant now, blurred beneath the sound of rotors that only she could still hear. Nathan spoke again, addressing everyone. This is what service looks like. It's not medals or speeches. It's people like her, those who disappear into the dust so the rest of us can come home. No one applauded this time. They simply listened. Ara exhaled, steadying herself. The memory still clung to her skin like smoke, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in it. Somewhere deep down, she could almost hear Merrick's voice again, faint, teasing, proud. Told you it'd be worth it. She smiled just a little. For the first time that night, it reached her eyes. And as the applause returned, gentle this time, almost reverent, she realized that maybe redemption doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes as quiet understanding in a room that finally knows the truth. Because dignity doesn't argue, it endures. And sometimes, when the world finally learns to see, it simply stands tall and lets respect do the speaking. The desert never leaves you. Even when Ara closed her eyes at night, years later, oceans away, she could still feel the grit between her teeth, the phantom heat against her skin. Time doesn't heal war, it just teaches you how to live inside the silence it leaves behind. The medevac had taken 3 hours to reach them that night. By then, the adrenaline was gone, and so was feeling in her left arm. A bullet had grazed through muscle and nerve, but she hadn't even noticed until the chopper's lights hit her sleeve and she saw the blood. She remembered Miller's voice on the headset, "We've got you, stay with us." She had stayed awake, staring through the open door of the Black Hawk as Afghanistan unrolled beneath her. Black sand, burning fields, the kind of darkness that feels alive. When the sun began to rise, she thought of home and realized she didn't know where that was anymore. She woke up 2 days later in a field hospital outside Kandahar. The air smelled of iodine and dust. Someone had written Resolute in marker on the band of her stretcher. A nurse told her they were calling it a miracle op, but no one would ever speak of it. Her team had been scattered. Some reassigned, some gone. Merrick's name would be carved into the memorial at Pendleton, but the details would stay sealed forever. Ara's commendation came in a manila envelope marked for record use only. No ceremony, no press, no closure. The pain meds dulled her arm, but not her mind. The quiet between the nurses' footsteps felt like punishment. She stared at the ceiling for hours, the hum of the air conditioner syncing with the pulse in her wounded hand. Then one night, when the base generators failed and the room plunged into stillness, she whispered into the dark, "Merrick, I got them out." No answer, of course, but somehow the silence didn't feel empty. Weeks later, when her papers came through, honorable discharge, medical reasons, the world shrank to a folder and a signature. The attending officer shook her hand, said, "You did good, Corporal," like he was talking about a completed report, not a life changed forever. She left the base wearing the same uniform she'd arrived in, one duffel slung over her shoulder, her right arm still stiff. The desert wind followed her out through the gate, and she thought, so this is how heroes disappear. Washington was colder than she remembered. The noise of normal life, traffic, chatter, laughter, felt alien. People moved fast, eyes on screens, never looking up. She tried to fit back into it, but the rhythm was gone. She found work fixing radios in a back alley repair shop, hands steady out of habit. She didn't need noise, she needed signal. Sometimes, when she soldered wires, she could almost hear the faint static of comms, ghost transmissions looping through her memory. When the nightmares came, she didn't fight them. She let them play out, dust shouting, the shimmer of heat through the scope. In dreams, Merrick still laughed. In dreams, the mission never ended. She never told anyone about the coordinates on the coin. They were engraved into her memory long before they were metal. The coin itself she kept in her jacket pocket, close to the scar near her jaw, a habit she didn't even realize she had until one day a stranger at a diner asked, "You ex-service?" She nodded. He said, "Thank you." She didn't know what to say, so she just said, "For what?" He smiled sadly, "For carrying what most of us can't see." That night, sitting alone in her small apartment, Ara realized the world didn't need to know what she'd done, but it needed to remember that people like her existed. Years passed like whispers. She kept in touch with almost no one from the unit. Task Force Resolute wasn't the kind of group you reminisced about, it was the kind you survived. Occasionally a letter would arrive, no return address, just a date and a place, scrawled in a familiar hand. She never went, but she kept them all in a box. Every once in a while, she'd take out the dog tags she'd carried that night and trace the engraved letters. Merrick J. 45,821. The metal had dulled with time, but when the light hit it just right, it still gleamed. The wound in her arm healed enough for her to work again, though the nerves never fully returned. She learned to live around it. She didn't talk about the pain, it was just part of her, like the scar beneath her ear, the trident inked on her wrist, the quiet discipline that never left. Then one morning, she received the invitation. An old friend, Captain Faber's widow, was being honored at the annual gala for her late husband's service. The letter was simple. It would mean something if you were there. She almost threw it away. But something stopped her. Maybe duty, maybe guilt, maybe the need to see if she could stand among them again and not feel like a ghost. So she put on her only uniform, the same one she'd worn the night of Griffin, and went. She hadn't expected the laughter. She hadn't expected Finch. But part of her wasn't surprised, because the world forgets easily and pride is louder than humility. What she hadn't expected was Miller. Seeing him there, alive, clean-shaven, in a uniform without blood on it, had cracked something open inside her. His salute wasn't just recognition. It was a bridge between two ghosts who'd finally found proof that the other one had survived. Back in the ballroom now, the noise was fading again. The applause had softened into murmurs, then quiet respect. People were still watching her, but their eyes were different, less curious, more human. Colonel Finch stood off to the side, his posture bent slightly as if carrying invisible weight. When their eyes met, he gave a short, almost reverent nod. She returned it, small, silent forgiveness. Nathan stepped closer. "You still have the coin." She nodded. "Keep it," he said. "They don't make those anymore." A faint smile ghosted her lips. "They never did." He chuckled quietly. "Fair point." For a while neither of them spoke. The music had resumed somewhere behind them, slow, gentle, nothing like before. Around them, conversation slowly filled the gaps. The evening moved on, but for Ara, time had changed direction. She could feel the weight of every moment that had led here. Every silence, every scar, every second she had chosen restraint over pride. And maybe that's what real strength was. Not in speaking first, not in fighting to be seen, but in knowing that dignity doesn't require witnesses. Nathan looked at her one last time. "You know, the world could use stories like yours. Maybe it's time people heard them." Ara's eyes flickered. "No," she said softly, "it's enough they finally believed it." He nodded slowly, understanding. Then he saluted her one last time, not as a gesture of rank, but as farewell between soldiers who had carried the same silence too long. As he turned to leave, Ara slipped the coin back into her pocket and whispered, "For them." And this time she smiled, not because the world had changed, but because she finally had. The night ended, but it didn't really end. Long after the last glass had been cleared, after the laughter and music had faded, the echo of that single salute still hung in the air of the ballroom. You could feel it, even in the empty hallways, a presence that refused to leave. Some nights change the course of a life. This one changed many. Colonel Finch was the first to linger. Long after the other officers had departed, he stood near the far wall, staring at the place where Ara Vance had stood. His reflection in the window looked older than it had that morning, his medals dull, his shoulders heavy. He'd spent 3 decades commanding troops, drilling etiquette, preaching discipline, believing respect came from rank and ribbons. And yet, a single corporal in a faded uniform had dismantled all of it without raising her voice. When he finally moved, it wasn't to call for his car, it was to sit, alone. He thought of his first command, the faces of young recruits he'd scolded for wearing boots that weren't polished enough, for saluting too slow, for showing up with creased fatigues. He thought of all the lessons he'd taught, and how few of them had anything to do with real courage. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than embarrassment. He felt conviction. That night he didn't sleep. He stayed in his quarters, the city lights flickering through his blinds, replaying every word, every sneer, every second before the silence had turned on him. And the image that haunted him most wasn't the salute, it was her eyes. Calm, forgiving. Forgiveness can cut deeper than anger. He poured himself a drink, set it aside untouched, and opened an old wooden box on his desk, one he hadn't looked at in years. Inside were photos from his deployments, the smiling faces of soldiers, some long gone, some lost in memory. He realized, staring at them, that he had never once truly seen them. Not like he saw Ara that night, a soldier stripped of everything visible, still standing proud. By dawn, Finch had written a letter, not an apology, a confession. He addressed it to the Armed Forces Foundation. It was short, formal, but honest. Respect must never be worn. It must be earned, and it must be recognized, especially when it comes from places our medals never reach. He didn't sign it as a colonel. He just signed it Alistair Finch. News of the incident spread quietly. Not in headlines, not in press releases. It moved the way truth does in the military world, through whispers, through retellings that lose none of their power. They called it the salute at the gala. No one could quite explain it. Some said a Navy SEAL had saluted a mystery woman from a classified unit. Others claimed she'd saved his life. Most didn't know her name, but all agreed on one thing. That night something sacred had been restored, a reminder that respect was not a performance. It was recognition. Young officers talked about it during late-night shifts. Cadets heard it in training halls, passed down like folklore. And somewhere along the way, the story stopped being about embarrassment or protocol. It became about humility. For Ara, life didn't change much on the surface. She returned to her small apartment the next morning, hung her jacket carefully on the back of the chair, and placed the coin beside the window where the sunlight could catch its tarnished edge. The noise of the city outside sounded softer than usual, like even the world was listening. She made coffee, black, strong, the kind she used to drink during briefings. The silence in her kitchen felt different now. Not empty, not hollow, just calm. When she sat at the table, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Vance. A pause, then a familiar voice, rough, warm, unmistakably military. You really know how to turn a gala into a battlefield. She smiled despite herself. Miller. You didn't think that coin would stay unnoticed forever, did you? Wasn't trying to be noticed. I know, he said softly. That's why you were. They both laughed, the kind of laugh that carries weight, not ease. After a moment, his tone changed. Listen, there's a program starting at Quantico. Support for transition vets, those who served in black units, those who can't exactly explain what they did. They need someone who understands silence. She didn't answer right away. She traced the edge of her coffee mug, watching the steam twist and vanish. "You think I can help?" she asked finally. "I think you already are," he said. "They just don't know it yet." There was a pause, not awkward, just familiar. "You don't owe anyone a story, Ara," he continued, "but you might save someone by listening to theirs." She looked at the coin glinting in the light, at the coordinates that had once meant survival, and thought, maybe that's the only mission left that matters. 3 months later, she stood outside a small training facility just outside Quantico. The sign read Veteran Reintegration Initiative. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and damp soil. She could hear laughter from inside, uncertain, nervous laughter from people who didn't know how to be civilians yet. She walked in quietly. The first thing she noticed was the wall covered with photos of men and women in uniform, no captions, just faces. Above it, a small plaque read, "They served. We remember." She stood there for a while before a young woman approached, early 20s, wearing fatigues too large for her frame. "Ma'am," the girl asked softly, "are you the new counselor?" Ara smiled faintly. "No, just someone who remembers what it feels like to start over." The girl nodded, uncertain but comforted. "Did you serve?" Ara hesitated. The old instinct to deflect, to stay hidden, rose again, but she let it fade. "Yes," she said, "a long time ago." The girl smiled. "Thank you." Ara didn't answer. She just placed a hand on the photo wall, over no face in particular, but over all of them at once. Behind her, a veteran laughed. Another argued about coffee strength. Life was messy, imperfect, alive again. And for the first time in years, Ara felt something ease inside her. Not peace exactly, but belonging. That night she returned home and sat by the window. The city glowed below like a constellation, each light a heartbeat. She took out Merck's dog tags and the coin. Side by side, they caught the faint reflection of the moonlight. Two symbols of the same truth, one for sacrifice, one for survival. She closed her eyes, hearing again the hum of that jammer, the chopper blades, the distant voices that never left her. But this time they didn't haunt, they kept her company. She whispered into the dark, the words she hadn't dared say in years. "I'm still here." The sound was soft, almost lost to the wind. But maybe somewhere, wherever soldiers go when they're gone, it was heard. Because sometimes, survival is the quietest kind of victory. The next morning, a letter arrived. No name, no address, just a single line typed neatly across the page. "For what it's worth, I saw you that night, and I'll never forget it." She folded the paper carefully, slipped it into the same box where she kept Merck's tags and the invitation. Then she picked up her jacket, checked the coin once more, and stepped outside. The sky was pale blue, the kind of day that asks nothing of you except that you live it. And so she did. It's strange how one night can keep echoing through the world, long after the lights go out. The gala had ended, the uniforms were pressed back into closets, and the news cycle moved on, yet that salute refused to die. It lived quietly in the minds of those who had seen it, reshaping things no medal ever could. For Colonel Finch, it began with silence. He spent his mornings differently now. No more grand speeches at the officers' club, no more easy jokes about protocol. Instead, he started walking the base grounds before sunrise, when the world was still half asleep and honest. He'd pass the young recruits jogging past in formation, the cadence of their voices echoing across the fog, and he'd feel the same ache every time, guilt mixed with gratitude. He once believed command was about authority, but command, he now realized, was about humility, about seeing the strength in others before the world does. A week after the gala, he requested reassignment, not to another staff post or ceremonial role, but to the training division at Fort Benning. His superiors were surprised. He was 2 years from retirement, but Finch insisted. He told them simply, "If I can teach even one cadet to look beyond the shine, I'll have done something that matters." He arrived at Bennying in the spring. No fanfare, no formal introduction, just an aging officer in plain fatigues walking among recruits half his age. They didn't know who he was at first. They only noticed that he listened, really listened. He stopped berating boots for scuffs. Instead, he asked where they'd come from, why they'd enlisted. When a nervous private froze during drill and dropped his rifle, Finch didn't shout, he picked it up, handed it back, and said quietly, "Courage isn't how you stand when you're seen. It's how you stand when you're not." The recruits didn't know where the line came from, but Finch did. He carried it from a ballroom where a woman in a faded uniform had taught him that truth doesn't shout. It stands still and lets time speak for it. Nathan Miller's life changed, too. He hadn't expected to feel anything that night, not really. He'd gone to the gala out of duty, not nostalgia. He'd buried his own ghosts under layers of medals and mission briefings. But seeing Ara again, seeing her stand in the quiet defiance of that moment, brought everything rushing back, the dust, the sound of her voice over the comms, the courage that had steadied his crew when the world was falling apart. He realized that he'd spent years surviving, not living. 2 weeks later, he filed for leave. The Navy called it rest and reassessment. He called it finally breathing. He visited the families of those who hadn't made it back from Griffin. No cameras, no uniform, just a man showing up with a folded flag and a story no one else could tell. He told them about Ara, about how their sons and daughters hadn't died in vain, how one quiet corporal had refused to give up when the mission had already been written off. One mother cried into his shoulder, another just nodded and said, "Thank you for remembering." Nathan left each house lighter, and yet heavier too. By the time he reached Virginia again, he'd made a decision. He joined Ara's program at Quantico, not as a speaker, but as a mentor. He taught veterans how to translate the language of war into the rhythm of life again. He told them the truth, that bravery didn't end when the battlefield did. And every time he saw Ara across the room, listening to another young soldier's story, he'd think of the word etched on that coin: resolute. For Ara, life had finally started to move at a pace she could live with. The counseling program at Quantico had grown faster than anyone expected. They didn't call it therapy. Veterans didn't trust that word. They called it debriefs, because sometimes it's easier to talk when it sounds like work. Her sessions weren't formal. She'd sit with them outside under the old oak tree behind the facility, coffee mugs steaming in the early light. No rank, no pretense, just soldiers being human again. Some days they spoke, some days they didn't. Silence, after all, was a language of its own. There was Corporal Jennings, who couldn't sleep unless a light was on. There was Captain Ramos, who hadn't spoken to his wife since coming home. There was young Emily Reyes, who couldn't stop blaming herself for surviving. Ara never told them her full story. She didn't have to. They could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at them, not with pity but with understanding. When Jennings broke down during a session, choking on guilt and exhaustion, Ara didn't offer advice. She just placed a steady hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't have to carry all of it alone." Later that evening, he told her, "That's the first time I believed that." One morning, as she was locking up, she found a small package by the door. No name, no return address. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping, an editorial written by Colonel Finch. The headline read, "The Measure of Respect, What a Quiet Soldier Taught Me About Leadership." Ara smiled faintly as she read. He'd written, "Her name doesn't matter, her uniform didn't shine, but her silence reminded me that valor doesn't need applause, it needs acknowledgement. I spent years teaching young soldiers to stand tall. Now I teach them to see who's standing beside them." At the bottom, there was no signature, just the same coordinates she'd carried on her coin. 34 degrees N, 67 degrees E. The place where everything had started. She folded the clipping and slipped it into her notebook, a small black leather journal filled with names, notes, and quiet thoughts she never shared aloud. She added one more line beneath Finch's words. Sometimes the battlefield is a memory, and the victory is simply remembering who you were there for. That evening she walked the Quantico grounds alone. The sun was low, painting the sky in gold and violet. Somewhere in the distance, recruits shouted cadence, the same rhythm that had once pulsed through her veins. She paused at the edge of the training field, watching them run. Their voices carried across the wind, full of life and youth and the kind of certainty she once had. For a moment she envied them. Then she smiled, because she knew what they didn't yet. That certainty fades, but purpose doesn't. Her phone buzzed, another message from Miller. "Heading your way tomorrow, got something for you." She replied with a single word, "Coffee." Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket and stood quietly, watching the light fade over the horizon. The next day, Miller arrived just after dawn, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He looked different, more rested, more himself. They sat on the bench outside the center, the air crisp with the smell of wet pine. He handed her a small envelope, from Finch. Inside was a photo, grainy, black and white, taken at the gala. It showed the moment of the salute. Finch in the background, Ara in her faded uniform, Miller's hand raised sharply. On the back, Finch had written 4 words. "Respect earned, never forgotten." Ara traced the handwriting, then looked out across the field. "He's learning," she said quietly. Miller nodded. "We all are." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that feels full instead of empty. After a long moment, Ara spoke. "You ever think about going back?" He smiled. "To the Navy, no, but maybe back to the reason I joined." She looked at him curiously. "To serve," he said simply, "just differently this time." Ara nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." That evening she stood by the photo wall again. The faces there seemed to watch her in the fading light. Some smiling, some solemn, all remembered. She placed the photo Finch had sent among them. No frame, no label, just one more story among many. And as she stepped back, she whispered to the faces, to the memory, to the ghosts that still lived in the corners of her heart. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The room was silent, peaceful. Outside, the sound of boots echoed faintly on the gravel path, the rhythm of a new generation learning how to walk the line between strength and compassion. And Ara Vance, the woman once mocked for wearing the wrong uniform, smiled into the dusk. Because maybe, just maybe, the world was finally learning to see beyond the shine. How far do you have to travel to meet the version of yourself you left behind? For Ara Vance, it began with a map, an old, creased one she kept folded in the back of her journal, the same one she'd traced with trembling fingers during those sleepless nights years ago, memorizing the numbers that would never fade. 34 degrees north, 67 degrees east. Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The place she thought she'd never return to. But now, years later, standing at the edge of a tarmac in Kabul, the wind hot and dry against her face, she realized she had never truly left, not in the ways that mattered. The flight had been long, the kind of journey that demands reflection. She accepted a quiet invitation, a joint humanitarian mission under the Veteran Reintegration Program. They were helping to build a new communication outpost near the ruins of an old forward base. No one knew that those ruins were what had once been Objective Griffin. She hadn't told Miller, she hadn't told anyone. Some roads have to be walked alone. As the transport van bounced down the dirt road toward the valley, Ara watched the horizon shimmer, endless sand, scattered poppy fields, distant ridges that seemed to breathe with heat. The smell was the same. The air, the dust, even the silence. When the van stopped, She stepped out slowly, boots crunching against the ground. The sound alone almost undid her. The others in her team moved ahead, busy with supply crates and radio parts. Ara stood still, just watching, her heart tugging her backward in time. And then she saw it. The broken outline of the compound. The same jagged archway half collapsed, the same tree still growing through the wall where she'd once taken cover. Nature had reclaimed the bones of the past, but she could still see it, the flashes, the smoke, the chaos. She walked forward until her knees trembled. The spot where Merck had fallen was just an empty patch of sand now, marked only by a single stone. Maybe someone had placed it there years ago, or maybe the wind had done it by chance. But in her heart, it felt like he'd been waiting. She knelt. Her fingers brushed the dirt, tracing the line where his blood had once soaked the earth. A deep breath caught in her chest, half a sob, half relief. "I kept them safe," she whispered. "You were right." The words broke something open inside her, not pain this time, but release. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the coin. It was darker now, worn from years of being carried, the engraved letters soft from her thumb. She turned it over in her palm, feeling the weight of the metal of memory. Resolute. The word gleamed faintly in the sunlight, defiant even now. She took the coin and pressed it gently into the sand beside the stone. The earth was hot against her skin, the warmth grounding her. "This belongs here," she murmured. "You belong here." A gust of wind swept past, scattering dust around her like a whisper. For a moment it sounded like laughter, Merck's laughter. Ara smiled through the tears. Then she sat down, cross-legged in the dirt, and pulled out her journal. She flipped to the last page and began to write. Hellman, 34 degrees N, 67 degrees E. I came back, not for answers but for peace. You don't come here to remember the war. You come here to remember why you survived it. I think I finally understand. It wasn't about victory, it was about keeping a promise. She stopped, staring at the horizon where the sun had begun to set. The light turned everything gold, even the ruins. "Good night, old friend," she whispered. And for the first time since that night so long ago, she didn't feel haunted. She felt whole. Later that evening, back at the temporary camp, Ara sat by the fire with a group of young volunteers, Afghan and American both, working side by side. One of them, a boy no older than 20, noticed her quiet demeanor and asked, "You've been here before, haven't you?" Ara smiled faintly. "A long time ago." "Was it bad then?" She looked out into the desert. The stars were starting to rise, scattered like silent witnesses. "It was different," she said softly. "Hard, but even then there was something worth saving." The boy nodded, thoughtful. "You sound like you miss it." She shook her head. "Not the fighting, the purpose." He stared into the fire. "My father was a soldier here," he said quietly. "He didn't come home." Ara's heart tightened. "I'm sorry." The boy smiled, a sad, brave smile. "It's okay. I think he'd be happy I'm helping build something now instead of breaking it." She looked at him, at the hope in his eyes, fragile but real, and felt a quiet pride swell in her chest. "He would be," she said. They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't hurt anymore. The flames flickered, the air hummed, and for a moment it felt like the world itself was healing. That night in her tent, Ara lay awake staring at the thin fabric ceiling. The sounds of the camp drifted around her, footsteps, laughter, the distant murmur of radios. She thought of Finch, probably packing some training field at dawn, telling his cadets to earn their silence. She thought of Miller, standing in a room full of veterans, telling them that survival was not failure. She thought of Merck, his grin, his voice. And she thought of herself, the woman who once stood trembling in a ballroom, mocked for wearing the wrong uniform, and now sat thousands of miles away, wearing no rank at all, yet finally at peace. War takes many things, but it also leaves behind something strange, a map of who you are when everything else has burned away. For Ara, that map had led her here, full circle. She whispered the words again, the same ones she had written earlier that day, as though saying them out loud might seal them into the air itself. I came back, not to remember but to let go. The wind outside stirred the tent flap, gentle as a sigh. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years she slept without dreaming of sand. Morning came soft and pink. She woke early, stepping out to the quiet hum of a waking camp. The horizon stretched wide and endless, the ruins now just shapes against the rising sun. She walked once more to where she had left the coin. The wind had half buried it overnight, only a glint of metal visible beneath the sand. She crouched, brushed the dust away, and whispered, "Stay." And then she smiled, turned, and walked back toward the trucks, leaving it behind, as if leaving a piece of herself finally home. As she climbed into the vehicle, one of the younger soldiers glanced at her and asked, "Everything all right, ma'am?" Ara looked back once more, the ruins glowing gold in the dawn. "Everything's exactly where it should be," she said. The engine started, the convoy rolled forward. And as they drove away, the coin caught the first full light of morning, a single flash of brilliance in the dust, before the wind carried it beneath the earth once more. Months passed, seasons changed. But the night of the salute, the quiet act that had rippled through ranks and hearts, refused to fade into memory. It lived quietly, like a story too sacred for ceremony, told only in low voices and quiet corners. And sometimes it wasn't told at all, it was simply remembered. At Fort Benning, Colonel Alastair Finch walked slowly along the training grounds, hands clasped behind his back. The morning was cool, mist rising from the grass. The recruits didn't know much about him. They called him the old colonel who doesn't yell. He preferred it that way. He watched as a young cadet stumbled during drill, fumbling his weapon. The boy winced, bracing for the rebuke, but Finch only smiled faintly, walked over, and adjusted the grip in the boy's hands. "Better," he said quietly, "but next time don't grip it out of fear. Grip it because someone's life might depend on it." The boy nodded, surprised. "Yes, sir." Finch looked out at the field, the early light spilling gold across the grass. He thought about how simple lessons could last a lifetime, how one silent salute had reshaped everything he thought he knew about leadership. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded slip of paper, worn, smudged, nearly torn at the edges. On it were 4 words, written in neat, steady handwriting. "Respect earned, never forgotten." He smiled softly, folded it back, and tucked it into his chest pocket close to his heart. In Virginia, at Quantico, Nathan Miller stood before a group of veterans in the training hall. The walls were covered with photos now, men and women, young and old, some smiling, some solemn. The room was silent as he spoke. "I don't care what patch you wore or what rank you held," he said, voice calm but heavy with conviction. "You came home, that's courage enough. You don't have to prove anything to anyone again." He paused, scanning their faces, seeing the same haunted eyes he'd once seen in the mirror. "Someone once reminded me," he continued, "that heroism doesn't always look like medals or parades. Sometimes it's just standing your ground when the world underestimates you and not saying a word." He smiled faintly. "That silence saved my life once." When the session ended, a few of the veterans stayed behind to thank him. One young woman, barely 30, a Marine medic, lingered. "Sir," she said quietly, "was it true that a SEAL once saluted a corporal at a gala?" Miller hesitated, then smiled. "It's true," he said, "and that salute was the easiest order I ever gave myself to follow." Across the country, life went on. The world was loud, busy, distracted, but every now and then the story found its way to the right ears. Someone would repeat it in a bar near a base, or an old commander would mention it during a lecture on humility. And in each retelling the details changed, the location, the ranks, the names, but the heart of it stayed the same. A soldier was mocked for what she wore. Then the truth stood tall, and silence became honor. As for Ara Vance, she didn't return to the spotlight. She never wanted to. After her trip to Afghanistan, she moved quietly between places, consulting with veteran programs, speaking softly in classrooms when invited, always leaving before anyone could make a fuss. To most, she was just another name on a roster. To those who knew, she was something else entirely, the steady hand on a shoulder, the voice that said just enough. Sometimes, when the new recruits at Quantico gathered around her during breaks, one of them would ask, "Ma'am, were you really part of a task force?" She'd smile, sip her coffee, and say, "Everyone's part of a task force. It's just that some missions are quieter than others." They'd laugh, not realizing how true that was. One rainy afternoon, months after her return, Ara visited Arlington Cemetery. The sky was gray, the air sharp with the scent of wet grass and stone. She carried no flowers, only a small notebook and a folded clipping, the one Finch had written, now creased and faded. She stopped before a section marked for those who had served in undisclosed operations. The names were few, the details minimal, but she knew them all. She traced the engraved letters of Merc J with the tip of her finger. "I went back," she whispered, "and I left the coin where it belonged." The rain began to fall harder, streaking down the marble. She didn't move. The sound was soft, like static, like the hum of an old comm signal fading into the wind. She took the notebook and wrote her final line beneath the others. "Some stories don't need to be told to be remembered. They live in how we carry ourselves afterward." She closed the notebook, pressed it against her chest, and breathed in the rain, clean, cold, alive. As she turned to leave, a young soldier passed by, pausing when he saw her standing there. He looked at her uniform, simple, unadorned, and said respectfully, "Ma'am, I like your patch." Ara smiled softly, "Thank you." He hesitated, never seen that one before. Her eyes glimmered with quiet amusement. "You're not supposed to." The young man grinned, nodded, and continued walking. Ara watched him go, her heart light. And as she stepped onto the path leading out of the cemetery, the clouds broke, sunlight spilling across the rows of white stones, bright and warm. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The light caught on her jacket, glinting off the small, worn edge of her unit patch, the hawk and lightning bolt. It shimmered just once before the breeze moved on. That evening, back in her small apartment, Ara sat by the window again, the same seat she had always favored, the city lights stretching endlessly below. On the table beside her lay the coin she'd left in Helmand, or rather, its twin. Miller had quietly left it for her before she'd gone. She turned it over, tracing the word resolute with her thumb, feeling its familiar weight. There were no coordinates on this one, just a single engraving, home. She smiled. Outside, the city pulsed with life, cars, voices, laughter, all the noise she'd once feared she couldn't return to. Now it sounded like belonging. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the world breathe around her. Because finally, after years of silence, she had nothing left to prove. Her dignity had spoken louder than any medal ever could. Her story had found its place, not in history books but in hearts. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Somewhere miles away, a group of new recruits at Fort Benning stood before a chalkboard where Colonel Finch had written a single quote. He turned to them and said, "You want to know what honor is? It's this." They read the words aloud. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts."